March 2010, Portland, Oregon. A city known for its bridges, rain-soaked streets, and the peculiar charm of its older neighborhoods. In the district of Selwood, where Victorian houses stand as silent witnesses to decades of history, a discovery was about to shake the foundations of what seemed like an ordinary community. Ethan Marlowe was 16 years old when his world changed forever. He had been living with his uncle Vincent for 3 months, a temporary arrangement following tensions in his family home that had become unbearable. His mother, struggling with financial difficulties and a recent divorce, had decided that Ethan would be better off spending some time away from the chaos. Vincent Marlowe, her older brother, had offered his home without hesitation. He lived alone in a 3-story Victorian house on a quiet street, the kind of place that looked charming from the outside but carried the weight of too many years without proper maintenance. Vincent was 52 years old, a man of few words who worked as a refrigeration technician for various commercial establishments around the city. He had lost his wife 4 years earlier to cancer, and since then he had lived in a solitude that seemed to suit him. Neighbors described him as polite but distant, someone who kept to himself and never caused trouble. For Ethan, those first weeks living with his uncle were marked by an uncomfortable silence that filled the house like a presence of its own. The relationship between uncle and nephew was functional, but cold. Vincent left early for work and returned late, often smelling of grease and chemical coolants. Dinner was usually eaten in silence, with the television providing the only sound in the dining room. Ethan attended the local high school, where he was still trying to fit in, and spent his afternoons doing homework or exploring the neighborhood on foot, anything to avoid the oppressive atmosphere of that house. March 14th was a Sunday. The sky over Portland was overcast, typical for that time of year, with a fine drizzle that seemed more like mist than actual rain. Vincent had left early that morning, mentioning something about an emergency call from a restaurant whose freezer had stopped working. Ethan found himself alone in the house with nothing to do and nowhere to go. He decided to organize his room, a small space on the second floor that still felt foreign to him despite the months he had spent there. While moving some boxes, he realized he needed tools to fix a drawer that had come off its tracks. He remembered seeing a toolbox somewhere in the house, and after searching the main floor without success, he concluded it must be in the basement. The basement was a place Vincent had explicitly told him not to go, not as a prohibition, but as a casual comment, something about it being full of old junk and potential hazards like exposed wiring. But that morning, with the house empty and the need for a simple screwdriver, Ethan decided the warning was more about liability than any real danger. The basement door was located in the kitchen, a heavy wooden door that creaked when opened. A steep staircase descended into darkness, and Ethan had to feel along the wall to find the light switch. A single bare bulb illuminated the space below, revealing a basement that was larger than he had imagined. The ceiling was low, with exposed beams and old pipes running across it. The concrete floor was stained and cracked in places, and the air had a dampness that made him wrinkle his nose. The basement was indeed full of junk. Old furniture covered with sheets, cardboard boxes stacked against the walls, garden tools hanging from nails, and various pieces of equipment Ethan couldn't identify. He spotted the red toolbox on a workbench against the far wall and started making his way toward it, navigating between the accumulated debris of years. That's when he noticed the smell. It was faint at first, masked by the general mustiness of the basement, but as he moved deeper into the space, it became more pronounced. It was a sweet, nauseating odor that seemed to cling to the back of his throat. Ethan had never smelled anything quite like it, but something instinctive in him recognized it as wrong, as a smell that shouldn't be there. He found the source behind a wall of stacked boxes near the corner farthest from the stairs. 6 large black plastic bags, the industrial kind used for construction debris, were arranged in 2 rows. They were sealed with duct tape, and the smell was definitely coming from them. Ethan's first thought was that his uncle had stored some kind of spoiled food or dead animal, maybe something from one of the refrigeration units he serviced. But the bags were too large, too deliberately hidden behind other items. His hands were shaking as he pulled one of the bags forward. It was heavier than he expected, and there was a disturbing solidity to its contents. Against every instinct telling him to leave it alone, Ethan found a box cutter on the workbench and carefully cut through the duct tape seal. The smell that escaped was overwhelming, forcing him to step back and cover his nose and mouth with his shirt. When he looked inside, his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. Bones. Unmistakably human bones, along with decomposed tissue, clothing fragments, and other materials he couldn't identify and didn't want to. The bag also contained what appeared to be a purse, still partially intact, the kind of detail that made everything horrifyingly real. Ethan sealed the bag as best he could with the tape and moved away, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He checked another bag just to be sure, just to confirm that what he had seen wasn't some kind of mistake or misunderstanding. The second bag contained similar contents: human remains, carefully packaged and hidden in his uncle's basement. The teenager ran up the stairs, forgetting about the toolbox, forgetting about everything except the need to get out of that space. In the kitchen, he bent over the sink, fighting the urge to vomit, his mind racing through impossible scenarios, trying to find an explanation that wasn't the obvious one. But there was no other explanation. His Uncle Vincent, the quiet man who had taken him in, who went to work every day and watched television every night, had dead bodies hidden in his basement. Ethan's first instinct was to call his mother, but something stopped him. If he called her, she would want to know every detail. She would panic. She would call Vincent directly. And Ethan realized, with a cold clarity that terrified him, that he had no idea what his uncle was capable of. If Vincent had done this, if he had killed people and kept their remains in his house, then confronting him directly could be dangerous. Extremely dangerous. Instead, Ethan grabbed the house phone and called the Portland Police Department's anonymous tip line. His voice was shaking as he gave the address and described what he had found. The operator asked for his name, but he hung up before providing it. He wasn't ready to be officially involved, not yet. He just needed someone to know, needed the authorities to investigate before Vincent came home and noticed that someone had been in the basement. After making the call, Ethan went to his room and sat on the bed, staring at the wall, trying to process what had just happened. Hours passed. Vincent returned home late in the afternoon, and Ethan came downstairs for dinner as usual, forcing himself to act normally even though every cell in his body was screaming that nothing was normal. His uncle seemed the same as always, tired from work, eating his food mechanically while watching the news. That night, Ethan barely slept. Every sound in the house made him jump, and he kept wondering if the police had received his call, if they would do anything about it, or if he had made a terrible mistake by staying in that house. The next 2 days were a blur of anxiety and fear. Ethan went to school, came back, ate dinner with Vincent, and waited. Waited for the police to arrive, waited for his uncle to notice something was wrong, waited for whatever was going to happen next. On the third day after his discovery, detectives finally knocked on the door. But by then, something else had already begun to unfold. Something that would turn this case into one of the most disturbing investigations Portland had seen in years. Because what Ethan didn't know, what nobody knew yet, was that his anonymous tip had set in motion a chain of events that would reveal far more than what was hidden in that basement. And the darkest revelations were still to come. The detectives assigned to the case were Adrian Cole and Marina Hewitt, both veterans of the Portland Police Bureau's Major Crimes Unit. Cole was 48, a methodical investigator known for his patience and attention to detail. Hewitt, 10 years younger, had built a reputation for her ability to connect seemingly unrelated pieces of evidence. Together, they had closed dozens of difficult cases, but nothing had prepared them for what they were about to uncover on that quiet street in Selwood. The anonymous tip had initially been treated as low priority. The department received dozens of such calls every week, many of them turning out to be false alarms or misunderstandings. But the caller's description had been specific enough to warrant at least a preliminary check. When Cole and Hewitt arrived at the Victorian house on the morning of March 17th, they expected to find nothing more than perhaps some improperly stored animal remains or misidentified materials. Vincent Marlowe answered the door in his work clothes, clearly preparing to leave for the day. He seemed genuinely confused by their presence, inviting them inside with the kind of cooperation that often characterized innocent people. The detectives explained they had received information about possible evidence of a crime on the property and asked for permission to look around. Vincent agreed immediately, signing the consent form without hesitation, even offering to show them through the house himself. But consent alone wasn't enough for what they needed to do. Cole and Hewitt conducted a visual walkthrough, noting the layout of the house and Vincent's behavior. He was calm, perhaps too calm, answering their questions about his work, his deceased wife, and his nephew who was staying with him. When asked about the basement, Vincent mentioned it was storage space he rarely used, full of items from his late wife and years of accumulated household goods. The detectives thanked him and left, but they were already planning their next move. Based on the specificity of the anonymous tip and their own professional instincts, They immediately began the process of obtaining a search warrant. The paperwork moved through the system with unusual speed, helped by a judge who understood the potential seriousness of the allegation. Within 48 hours, they had legal authorization to conduct a thorough search of the property. When they returned on March 19th, they brought a forensic team with them. Vincent was at work and Ethan was at school. The house was empty when they broke the seal on the front door and entered with their equipment. Cole led the team directly to the basement, following the description from the anonymous tip. The smell hit them before they even reached the bottom of the stairs. That distinctive odor that experienced investigators knew immediately. The black plastic bags were exactly where the caller had described them. The forensic team documented everything with photographs and measurements before carefully opening each bag. What they found confirmed their worst suspicions. Human remains in various states of decomposition, packaged with a methodical precision that suggested premeditation and an attempt at long-term concealment. Initial examination indicated the remains belonged to at least 2 different individuals. The discovery transformed the quiet house into a crime scene. Yellow tape went up around the property. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, their faces a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. News vans arrived within hours, their satellite dishes extending into the gray Portland sky. The Victorian house that had stood unremarkably for decades was suddenly the center of a media storm. Vincent Marlowe was picked up at his workplace and brought in for questioning. He sat across from Cole and Hewitt in an interrogation room, his face showing confusion that seemed entirely genuine. He denied any knowledge of the remains, suggested that perhaps they had been placed there by a previous owner, or that someone had broken into his basement without his knowledge. His story was full of holes, but he stuck to it with a consistency that was either the mark of innocence or careful preparation. Meanwhile, the forensic team was expanding their search. They examined every inch of the basement looking for additional evidence. They found traces of cleaning chemicals, scratches on the concrete floor suggesting something heavy had been dragged, and fibers that would later prove significant. Upstairs, they searched Vincent's bedroom, his office, and every closet and drawer. They seized his computer, his phone records, and boxes of personal documents. The investigation into Vincent's background revealed a man who had lived an apparently normal life. He had been married to Ruth Marlowe for 23 years before her death from ovarian cancer in 2006. He had worked in refrigeration for nearly 3 decades, with no criminal record, not even a traffic violation. Neighbors described him as quiet, helpful when asked, someone who kept his lawn maintained and never caused problems. The picture that emerged was of a man who blended perfectly into suburban normalcy, but investigators knew that the most dangerous criminals were often the ones who appeared most ordinary. They began the painstaking process of identifying the victims. The remains were sent to the state medical examiner's office, where forensic anthropologists and pathologists worked to extract DNA, examine dental records, and determine causes of death. The condition of the remains suggested they had been in the basement for several years, which expanded the timeline of the investigation considerably. Cole and Hewitt started pulling missing persons reports from the Portland area, focusing on the years following Ruth Marlowe's death. They cross-referenced physical characteristics with the preliminary assessments from the medical examiner. They interviewed Vincent's co-workers, his few friends, and anyone who might have seen something unusual. They examined his financial records, looking for unexplained purchases or suspicious transactions. Ethan was interviewed separately, with a child psychologist present due to his age. He admitted to making the anonymous call and described finding the bags in the basement. His account was detailed and consistent, showing no signs of fabrication. The detectives were gentle with him, recognizing the trauma of his discovery and the complicated position he was in as Vincent's nephew. They asked him about his uncle's behavior, any strange activities, visitors to the house, anything that might provide a clue. The teenager mentioned that Vincent often worked late, sometimes not returning until after midnight. He recalled that his uncle kept the basement locked most of the time, though the door had been unlocked that Sunday morning. He described Vincent as distant, but not threatening, someone who seemed to want to be left alone. There had been no warning signs, nothing that would have suggested what was hidden below the kitchen floor. By the end of the 3rd day of investigation, the situation had reached a critical point. The evidence was overwhelming, but Vincent continued to maintain his innocence. The medical examiner's office was working around the clock to identify the victims. The media coverage was intensifying, with reporters camped outside the police station and the Marlowe house. And then, on the morning of March 20th, something happened that would shift the entire trajectory of the case. Ethan Marlowe disappeared, and within hours, so did Vincent. The morning of March 20th began like any other in the temporary foster home where Ethan had been placed, following the discovery at his uncle's house. Child Protective Services had removed him from Vincent's custody as a precautionary measure while the investigation continued. The foster family, experienced in handling traumatized youth, had been briefed on the sensitivity of the situation. Ethan was scheduled to attend school that day, an attempt to maintain some semblance of normalcy in the midst of the chaos his life had become. But when the foster mother went to wake him at 7 in the morning, his room was empty. The bed had been slept in. His backpack was still on the chair. His phone and wallet sat on the nightstand. The window was closed from the inside. There was no sign of a struggle, no note, nothing to indicate where he had gone or why. The foster mother immediately called her agency coordinator, who in turn contacted the police. Within 30 minutes, Detectives Cole and Hewitt were at the house, examining the empty room with a growing sense of dread. The timing was impossibly suspicious. Ethan had been the key witness in the case against Vincent Marlowe, the person who had discovered the remains and could testify about the layout of the house and his uncle's behavior. His disappearance, just 3 days after that discovery, sent alarm bells ringing through the entire investigation team. The question that nobody wanted to voice but everyone was thinking was whether Vincent had somehow gotten to his nephew. A check on Vincent Marlowe's whereabouts revealed that he too was missing. He had been released on bail 2 days earlier, a decision that now seemed catastrophically wrong. The bail hearing had been contentious, with prosecutors arguing for remand but the judge ultimately deciding that Vincent's clean record and community ties justified release under strict conditions, including surrender of his passport and daily check-ins with the court. Vincent had complied with his first check-in, appearing at the courthouse as required, but that morning he had failed to appear, and he wasn't at his house, wasn't at his workplace, and wasn't answering his phone. The Portland Police Bureau immediately issued an alert for both Ethan and Vincent. Ethan was classified as a missing endangered juvenile, while Vincent was wanted for questioning in connection with the disappearance. Every officer in the city received photographs and descriptions. The media, already saturated with coverage of the basement discoveries, seized on this new development with renewed intensity. The story transformed from a historical murder investigation into an active crisis with a missing teenager potentially in the hands of a suspected killer. Detectives began retracing Vincent's movements from the moment of his release. Security footage from the courthouse showed him leaving alone, getting into his car, a 10-year-old gray sedan. Traffic cameras tracked his route back to Selwood, where he entered his house at approximately 4 in the afternoon. Neighbors reported seeing lights on that evening, but nobody had observed him leaving. The next morning, he had appeared for his court check-in as required, then seemingly vanished. Investigators obtained footage from cameras near the foster home where Ethan had been staying. The breakthrough came from a traffic camera 2 blocks away, which had captured Vincent's sedan passing by at 2:30 in the morning on March 20th. The timestamp placed it just hours before Ethan was discovered missing. The car was moving slowly, as if the driver was searching for something or someone. It passed the camera heading west, then appeared again 20 minutes later, heading east. The theory that formed was chilling in its implications. Vincent had somehow located where Ethan was staying, despite the placement being confidential. He had either convinced his nephew to come with him voluntarily, or he had taken him by force. Given that Ethan's belongings were left behind and there was no sign of a struggle, investigators leaned toward the possibility that Vincent had contacted Ethan and arranged a meeting, perhaps claiming he needed to talk or explain something. A warrant was issued for Vincent's arrest, upgrading the charges to include kidnapping. His photograph was distributed to every law enforcement agency in the Pacific Northwest. Border crossings were alerted. His financial records were monitored for any transactions that might indicate his location. His cell phone, which had been turned off, was tracked to its last known location in northeast Portland, where it appeared to have been discarded or destroyed. Detectives interviewed everyone who knew Vincent, looking for properties he might have access to, friends who might shelter him anywhere he could be hiding with Ethan. His work record showed he had serviced refrigeration units all over the Portland metro area and into the surrounding counties. Each location became a potential hiding place to investigate. Teams of officers fanned out across the region, checking warehouses, storage units, and vacant properties. The search expanded to include Vincent's financial history going back years. Investigators discovered that he had inherited a small amount of money from his wife's estate, which he had used to pay off the mortgage on the Victorian house. But there were also several unexplained cash withdrawals in the months following her death, totaling thousands of dollars. The money had gone somewhere, but there was no obvious trace of what it had been used for. While the search for Ethan intensified, the investigation into the basement remains continued. The medical examiner's office had made progress in identifying the victims. Dental records and DNA analysis had produced matches in missing persons databases. The first victim was confirmed as Leah Brennan, a 28-year-old woman who had disappeared in October of 2007. She had last been seen leaving her apartment in southeast Portland, telling her roommate she was meeting someone about a potential job opportunity. She had never returned, and despite her family's efforts, the case had eventually gone cold. The second victim was identified as Iris Dalton, 32 years old, missing since June of 2008. Iris had been a freelance photographer, living alone in a small studio apartment. She had told friends she was photographing a historic house for a potential client. Her car had been found abandoned near the Willamette River 2 weeks after her disappearance, but there had been no other leads. Until now, the connection between the two women wasn't immediately obvious. They had moved in different social circles, lived in different neighborhoods, and had different professions. But as investigators dug deeper, a link emerged. Both women had, in the months before their disappearances, hired contractors for work on their homes. Leah had needed her refrigerator repaired. Iris had required work on her apartment's cooling system during an unusual heat wave. The contractor they had both used was listed in their records under a small independent business name, but the phone number traced back to Vincent Marlowe. This discovery provided the prosecution with a potential motive and method. Vincent had used his work as a refrigeration technician to gain access to victims, establishing trust through legitimate business interactions before escalating to violence. The pattern suggested premeditation and careful victim selection. It also raised the terrifying possibility that there might be more victims, women who had hired him for repairs and then vanished without anyone connecting the dots. But all of this evidence meant nothing if they couldn't find Ethan. Every hour that passed reduced the likelihood of finding him alive. Search and rescue teams combed through Forest Park and other wilderness areas where a vehicle might be hidden. Dive teams checked bodies of water. The public was asked to report any sightings of Vincent's car or anyone matching their descriptions. On the fourth day of the search, a ranger in Mount Hood National Forest called in a report. He had seen what might have been Vincent's vehicle on a remote Forest Service road, heading toward an area known for scattered hunting cabins and abandoned structures. It was the first solid lead they had received, and it would change everything. The Forest Service road wound deep into Mount Hood National Forest, a vast wilderness area that stretched for hundreds of square miles across the Cascade Range. The terrain was rugged and densely forested, with countless isolated cabins and structures scattered throughout, many of them seasonally occupied or long abandoned. For someone trying to disappear with a captive, it was nearly perfect terrain. For law enforcement trying to conduct a search, it was a nightmare. Detective Cole coordinated with the Clackamas County Sheriff's Office and the Forest Service to organize a systematic search of the area where the ranger had reported the possible sighting. Helicopter units equipped with thermal imaging cameras flew grid patterns over the forest, looking for heat signatures that might indicate human presence. Ground teams moved methodically through the woods, checking every structure marked on Forest Service maps. It was slow, dangerous work, and everyone involved knew that time was critical. While the search operation mobilized in the mountains, Detective Hewitt remained in Portland, continuing to build the case against Vincent Marlowe. The identification of Leah Brennan and Iris Dalton had opened new investigative avenues, and she was determined to understand every detail of how these women had crossed paths with their killer. She began by interviewing the families and friends of both victims, painful conversations that required delicacy and patience. Leah Brennan's mother still lived in Portland, in the same house where Leah had grown up. She was a woman in her 60s who had never stopped hoping her daughter would be found alive, even after 7 years. When Hewitt informed her that remains had been identified and that a suspect was in custody, the mother's reaction was a complicated mixture of grief and relief. At least now she knew. At least the uncertainty was over. She provided Hewitt with boxes of Leah's belongings, including appointment books and receipts that might help establish the timeline of her final days. In those records, Hewitt found what she was looking for, a receipt dated September 27, 2007, for refrigerator repair work. The amount was modest, just under $200, and the company name matched the independent business Vincent had operated as a side venture from his regular employment. Leah's mother remembered the repair, recalled that the technician had been professional and quiet, that he had fixed the problem quickly and left without incident. She had no reason to think anything was wrong. 3 weeks later, Leah disappeared. Iris Dalton's case provided similar evidence. Her parents, who lived in Eugene, had preserved many of her possessions after her disappearance, holding on to the hope that she would someday need them again. Among her papers was a work order for air conditioning repair, dated May 15, 2008. The same business name, the same contact number. Iris had written a note in her calendar about the appointment, mentioning that the technician had been polite and had given her advice about maintaining the system to prevent future problems. Less than a month later, she was gone. The pattern was becoming clear. Vincent had used his legitimate work to identify potential victims, women who lived alone and who had let him into their homes. He had established himself as trustworthy, helpful, someone who could solve their problems. And then, at some point after the initial contact, he had returned. The exact mechanism of the abductions remained unclear, but the connection through his work was undeniable. Hewitt expanded her search through missing persons databases, looking for other women who fit the profile and who had disappeared during the years following Vincent's wife's death. She found 4 more cases that warranted closer examination. All were women between the ages of 25 and 40, all lived alone, and all had vanished without clear explanation between 2006 and 2009. She began the process of contacting the families, asking about home repairs, about service calls, about any contractors who might have worked in their homes. 2 of the families confirmed that their missing daughters had hired someone for appliance or cooling system work in the months before disappearing. In both cases, the records had been discarded or lost over the years, but the families remembered the timing and the general nature of the work. Either family could confirm the name of the company or technician, but the coincidence was too strong to ignore. The possibility that Vincent Marlowe had killed not 2 women, but potentially 6 or more transformed the investigation from a double homicide into something far more disturbing. The forensic team, meanwhile, had completed their examination of the remains found in the basement. The medical examiner's report confirmed that both Leah and Iris had died from blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with being struck with a heavy object. The injury suggested sudden, violent attacks rather than prolonged suffering, a detail that provided small comfort to the families but helped investigators understand Vincent's methodology. He had killed quickly, then transported the bodies to his basement where he had stored them with methodical precision. The basement itself revealed additional secrets under forensic scrutiny. Luminol testing exposed traces of blood that had been carefully cleaned, indicating that the space had potentially been used as a kill site, not just for storage. The scratches on the concrete floor, when examined more closely, formed patterns consistent with heavy bags being dragged from one area to another. Chemical analysis of the cleaning products found in the basement showed the presence of industrial-strength solutions designed to eliminate biological evidence. Investigators also discovered that Vincent had made modifications to the basement in the years following his wife's death. Neighbors recalled seeing a dumpster outside the house for several weeks in late 2006, and building supply stores confirmed purchases Vincent had made for concrete, lumber, and ventilation equipment. He had essentially rebuilt part of the basement, creating a space that could be sealed and ventilated independently from the rest of the house. The level of planning was chilling. Vincent's computer, seized during the initial search, was forensically examined by digital specialists. The hard drive revealed extensive research into missing persons investigations, forensic techniques, and case studies of serial killers who had been caught. He had studied how other criminals had been identified, learning from their mistakes. He had also visited forums and websites discussing methods of body disposal, though he had used privacy software to mask his activities. The digital forensics team was able to recover some of this history, painting a picture of someone who had carefully educated himself on how to avoid detection. Perhaps most disturbing was a folder of photographs found buried in the computer's file system. The images showed women in various public settings, taken with a telephoto lens from a distance. Some of the women were identifiable as the victims already discovered. Others remained unidentified, raising the horrifying possibility that Vincent had been stalking additional targets who might still be alive or whose disappearances had not yet been connected to him. All of this evidence was building a comprehensive portrait of Vincent Marlowe as a calculated predator who had operated undetected for years. But it still didn't answer the most pressing question. Where was Ethan? The teenager had been missing for 5 days now, and the statistical likelihood of a positive outcome decreased with every passing hour. The pressure on the search teams was immense, the media coverage relentless, and the public's fear palpable. Then on the evening of March 25th, the breakthrough came. Not from the helicopter searches or the ground teams, but from an unexpected source. A phone call to the police tip line, anonymous like the original call that had started everything, but this time with information that would finally lead them to where Vincent had taken his nephew. The call came in at 6:47 in the evening, to the same tip line Ethan had used 2 weeks earlier. The voice was male, older, hesitant but clear. He identified himself only as someone who occasionally hiked in the Mount Hood National Forest area and had seen something unusual. 3 days prior, while exploring an old logging road that had been closed to vehicle traffic for years, he had noticed fresh tire tracks leading off the main path toward a hunting cabin he knew was back in the woods. The cabin had been abandoned for at least a decade, its original owner having died and the property falling into a legal limbo that left it unclaimed and unused. What made him call was not just the tire tracks, but what he had seen when curiosity led him closer to the cabin. A gray sedan was parked behind the structure, partially covered with branches and a tarp in what appeared to be an attempt at concealment. He hadn't approached further, something about the scene feeling wrong, but the news coverage of the missing teenager and the manhunt for Vincent Marlowe had been playing on his mind ever since. He provided specific directions to the location, including GPS coordinates he had marked on his hiking device, then hung up before the operator could ask more questions. Detective Cole received the information within minutes and immediately contacted the tactical team that had been staged near the forest for exactly this kind of lead. The decision was made to move quickly but carefully. If Vincent was indeed at the cabin with Ethan, a poorly executed approach could result in tragedy. A hostage negotiator was brought in, along with members of the regional SWAT team who specialized in woodland operations. The plan was to establish a perimeter around the cabin before dawn, confirm the presence of the vehicle and any occupants, and then attempt contact. The convoy of law enforcement vehicles moved through the darkness on forest roads with their lights off, guided by officers familiar with the terrain. They parked nearly a mile from the target location and proceeded on foot, their movements silent and coordinated. Thermal imaging from a helicopter that maintained a high altitude to avoid detection showed 2 heat signatures inside the cabin, one larger and one smaller, consistent with an adult and a teenager. The gray sedan was exactly where the caller had described, its license plate matching Vincent's vehicle. As dawn broke over the forest on March 26th, the perimeter was secure. Sharpshooters were positioned on elevated ground with clear sight lines to the cabin's entrance and windows. The negotiator established communication via a loudspeaker, identifying himself in the presence of law enforcement, and requesting that Vincent come out peacefully. There was no response. The same message was repeated every few minutes, growing more insistent with each iteration. Inside the cabin, Ethan heard the voices. He had been held in a small room that might have once been a pantry or storage space, barely larger than a closet. The door was secured from the outside with a heavy padlock, and the single small window had been boarded over. He had been given minimal food and water over the 5 days of captivity, just enough to keep him alive. His uncle had said very little to him during this time, speaking only to issue brief instructions or warnings. Vincent had forced Ethan into the car that early morning by appearing at the foster home with a gun, waiting outside until the teenager came out for what Vincent claimed was an urgent talk about the investigation. Once in the vehicle, Vincent had revealed his plan was simply to disappear, and that Ethan was coming with him as insurance. The drive to the forest had taken hours on winding roads, and when they arrived at the cabin, Vincent had immediately locked his nephew in the small room. Now, hearing the police presence outside, Ethan began pounding on the door and shouting. His voice was weak from dehydration and days of limited use, but he put everything he had into making himself heard. Vincent appeared at the door, his face drawn and aged beyond the weeks since Ethan had last really looked at him. He was holding the same gun he had used to force compliance, and for a moment the teenager thought his uncle might use it. But instead, Vincent simply stood there, the weapon lowered at his side, staring at the locked door as if trying to decide something. The negotiator outside heard Ethan's shouts and immediately adjusted his approach, addressing the teenager directly, telling him help was close and to stay calm. The confirmation that Ethan was alive and able to call out transformed the operation's dynamic. This was no longer a search but a rescue, and the urgency increased exponentially. The tactical commander made the decision to prepare for forced entry if Vincent did not surrender within the next 30 minutes. Vincent moved away from the pantry door and went to one of the cabin's windows, peering through a gap in the boards. He could see officers in tactical gear positioned in the tree line, could see the long barrels of rifles pointed toward the structure. He knew there was no escape, had probably known it since the moment he decided to take Ethan. Everything that had happened since the discovery in his basement felt like a dream from which he was slowly waking, each moment bringing him closer to an inevitable end. He walked to the cabin's front door and opened it slowly, his hands visible and empty. The gun had been left inside on a table. Officers immediately began shouting commands, ordering him to walk forward with his hands on his head, to kneel, to lie face down on the ground. Vincent complied with each instruction mechanically, showing no resistance as he was secured in handcuffs and led away from the cabin. The tactical team moved in immediately, breaking the padlock on the pantry door and pulling Ethan out into the main room. The teenager was dehydrated, frightened, and exhausted, but he was alive and appeared to have no serious physical injuries. Paramedics who had been standing by rushed forward, beginning immediate assessment and treatment. Ethan was wrapped in blankets, given water in small measured amounts, and prepared for transport to the nearest hospital. As he was being carried out on a stretcher, Ethan caught sight of his uncle being placed into a police vehicle. Vincent turned and looked directly at his nephew, and for just a moment their eyes met. Ethan saw something in that gaze that he would spend years trying to understand. Not anger or hatred, not even regret, just emptiness, as if the man who had taken him was already gone, leaving behind only a shell that moved and breathed, but contained nothing human. The scene at the cabin became controlled chaos as investigators moved in to process the location. The structure was small, just 3 rooms plus the pantry where Ethan had been held. There was evidence Vincent had been living there for the duration, with supplies indicating he had planned for an extended stay. Maps of the surrounding forest were found, along with camping equipment and additional food stores. Whether he had intended to remain at the cabin indefinitely or was planning to move again remained unclear. More significantly, investigators found a notebook in which Vincent had been writing. The entries were rambling and disconnected, some dated and some not, covering the period from his wife's death through his arrest and flight. The contents would later be analyzed by psychologists and would become key evidence in understanding his mental state and the progression of his crimes. But for now, it was simply catalogued and secured as evidence. Ethan was transported by helicopter to a hospital in Portland, where he was treated for dehydration, minor injuries, and the psychological trauma of his ordeal. His mother, who had been frantically following every development in the case, was waiting when he arrived. The reunion between mother and son was emotional and private, a moment of relief in the midst of tragedy. Vincent Marlowe was taken to the Clackamas County Jail, where he was booked on charges of kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and unlawful flight to avoid prosecution, in addition to the existing charges related to the murders. He was placed in isolation for his own safety and remained largely silent, speaking only to request an attorney. The investigation was far from over, but the immediate crisis had been resolved. The next phase would be about justice. The weeks following Vincent Marlowe's capture were consumed by the intricate process of building a prosecutorial case that would ensure justice for the victims and their families. The Multnomah County District Attorney's Office assigned a senior prosecutor, Catherine Voss, to lead the effort. Voss had decades of experience with complex homicide cases and understood that despite the overwhelming evidence, every detail needed to be meticulously documented and presented to ensure there would be no possibility of a mistrial or successful appeal. The charges against Vincent were formally expanded in early April. He faced 2 counts of aggravated murder in the first degree for the deaths of Leah Brennan and Iris Dalton, 1 count of kidnapping in the first degree for taking Ethan, 1 count of unlawful imprisonment, and multiple counts of abuse of a corpse. Each charge carried significant prison time, and the aggravated murder charges made him eligible for life imprisonment without the possibility of parole under Oregon law, which had abolished the death penalty years earlier. Vincent's defense attorney, a public defender named Marcus Chen, faced an almost impossible task. The evidence was substantial, and the public sentiment was overwhelmingly against his client. Chen's strategy focused not on proving innocence, which seemed untenable given the circumstances, but on establishing mitigating factors that might influence sentencing. He requested psychological evaluations of Vincent, hoping to demonstrate diminished capacity or mental illness that might have contributed to his actions. The psychological evaluations were conducted over several weeks by court-appointed experts. Vincent participated in extensive interviews and testing, his demeanor throughout remaining flat and emotionless. The resulting reports painted a complex picture of a man who had experienced significant trauma from his wife's prolonged illness and death, but who retained full understanding of right and wrong, and had demonstrated clear premeditation in his crimes. The experts concluded that while Vincent showed signs of depression and social isolation, he did not meet the legal threshold for insanity or diminished capacity. Meanwhile, investigators continued examining the 4 additional missing persons cases that Hewitt had identified as potentially connected to Vincent. 2 of these cases showed strong circumstantial links through his work records and the timing of disappearances, but without physical evidence or remains, prosecutors made the difficult decision not to include them in the formal charges. The families of these women were informed of the suspicions and the evidence that existed, but also told that without more concrete proof, justice through the legal system remained out of reach. The notebook found at the cabin became a subject of intense scrutiny. Vincent's writings revealed a man who had spiraled into darkness following his wife's death, viewing her loss as a fundamental injustice that broke something essential in his worldview. He wrote about feeling disconnected from other people, about watching them go about their lives while he existed in a state of perpetual grief. The entries never explicitly detailed his crimes, but they contained veiled references to actions taken and problems solved, language that prosecutors believed constituted an indirect confession. One entry, dated November 2007, read, "The noise stopped today. Finally quiet in the house again. Aye. Ruth would understand that some problems require permanent solutions. The basement holds more than memories now." The date corresponded to approximately 1 month after Leah Brennan's disappearance. Another entry from July 2008 mentioned, "Another repair completed. Some systems can't be fixed, only replaced. Storage capacity adequate for foreseeable needs." This was weeks after Iris Dalton vanished. Ethan's recovery was slow but steady. He worked with trauma counselors who specialized in adolescents who had experienced violent crime. The physical effects of his captivity faded relatively quickly, but the psychological impact was more enduring. He struggled with nightmares, with anxiety about being alone, with the complicated feelings that came from being victimized by a family member who had also sheltered him. His mother withdrew him from the Portland school system, and they relocated to a small town in eastern Oregon, seeking distance from the media attention and the traumatic memories. As summer turned to fall, preparations for trial intensified. The prosecution team organized their evidence into a coherent narrative that would be presented to a jury. They prepared witness testimony from the forensic experts, from Ethan, from the families of the victims, and from the investigators who had worked the case. They created visual presentations showing the timeline of events, the connections between Vincent and his victims, and the evidence recovered from his home and the cabin. The defense prepared their own case, focusing on Vincent's mental state and the circumstances of his wife's death. Chen located witnesses who testified to Vincent's devotion to Ruth during her illness, to how he had cared for her through months of chemotherapy and pain, and to how her death had devastated him. The strategy was to humanize Vincent, to show the jury that he had once been a caring person who had been broken by circumstances beyond his control. The trial began on January 10, 2011, nearly 10 months after Ethan's discovery in the basement. The courthouse in downtown Portland was surrounded by media trucks and protesters, some calling for the harshest possible sentence, while others opposed to lengthy imprisonment on principle demonstrated on the opposite side of the street. Security was heightened with metal detectors and additional officers stationed throughout the building. Jury selection took 3 days, with both sides carefully screening potential jurors for bias and preconceptions about the case. The final jury consisted of 7 women and 5 men, ranging in age from mid-20s to late 60s, representing a cross-section of the Portland community. They were sequestered once testimony began, isolated from media coverage to ensure their verdict would be based solely on evidence presented in court. The prosecution's opening statement laid out the case in stark terms. Voss described how Vincent Marlowe had used his position of trust as a service technician to identify vulnerable women, how he had killed them and concealed their remains, and how he had kidnapped his own nephew when threatened with exposure. She promised to present overwhelming physical evidence, credible witness testimony, and Vincent's own writings that demonstrated his guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. Chen's opening was more subdued. He acknowledged that terrible crimes had occurred, but asked the jury to consider the full context of Vincent's life and mental state. He spoke of a man destroyed by grief, acting in ways that he himself might not fully understand, and urged the jury to remember that justice required consideration of all factors, not just the outcome of actions, but the circumstances that led to them. The testimony phase lasted 3 weeks. Ethan took the stand on the 5th day, his voice quiet but steady as he described finding the bags in the basement and his subsequent captivity. Cross-examination was gentle, with Chen focusing on establishing that Vincent had not physically harmed Ethan during the kidnapping, had provided food and water, and had ultimately surrendered without violence. It was a small point in an ocean of damning evidence, but it was all the defense had. Forensic experts testified about the remains, the cause of death determinations, and the evidence found in the basement. Families of the victims gave impact statements describing the years of uncertainty they had endured and their grief at finally learning their loved ones' fates. Detectives Cole and Hewitt walked the jury through the investigation, the discoveries made, and the connections established between Vincent and the victims. Vincent himself never testified. Chen advised against it, knowing that cross-examination would be brutal and that Vincent's flat affect and emotionless demeanor would likely alienate the jury rather than generate sympathy. Instead, the defense presented their psychological experts, who testified about Vincent's mental state and the impact of prolonged grief and trauma on human behavior. The closing arguments came in early February. Voss systematically reviewed every piece of evidence, building an irrefutable case that Vincent Marlowe had committed premeditated murder and had demonstrated no remorse or empathy for his victims. Chen made an emotional plea for the jury to consider mercy, to recognize that the man who committed these crimes was himself a victim of circumstances that had destroyed his capacity for normal human connection. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous on all counts. Guilty of 2 counts of aggravated murder in the 1st degree, guilty of kidnapping, guilty of unlawful imprisonment, guilty on all charges of abuse of a corpse. Vincent showed no reaction as the verdicts were read, his face remaining expressionless as it had throughout the trial. Sentencing occurred 1 week later. Under Oregon law, the judge had limited discretion given the nature of the convictions. Vincent Marlowe was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole on each murder count, to be served consecutively. Additional sentences for the kidnapping and other charges were added, though they were largely symbolic given the life terms. The judge, in delivering the sentence, noted that while the court recognized the defendant had suffered personal tragedy, nothing could justify or excuse the taking of innocent lives and the suffering inflicted on families, and on Ethan Marlowe. The families of Leah Brennan and Iris Dalton were present for the sentencing. Both mothers addressed the court, speaking directly to Vincent about the daughters they had lost and the years of pain his actions had caused. Vincent listened without apparent emotion, offering no apology or explanation. When given the opportunity to make a statement, he declined, remaining silent as he had for most of the proceedings. Vincent was transferred to the Oregon State Penitentiary, where he would spend the remainder of his life. In the years that followed, he gave no interviews, made no confessions about potential additional victims, and maintained almost complete silence about his crimes. The house in Selwood was eventually sold at auction, the proceeds divided among the victims' families as part of a civil settlement. Ethan continued his recovery, gradually rebuilding his life in a new community. He completed high school and went on to college, choosing to study psychology with the goal of helping other trauma survivors. He rarely spoke publicly about his experience, preferring to move forward rather than remain defined by those terrible weeks in 2010. The case of Vincent Marlowe officially closed on March 14, 2011, exactly 1 year after Ethan had descended into that basement and discovered what his uncle had hidden there. It stood as a reminder that evil could exist behind the most ordinary facades, that the people who appeared most normal could harbor the darkest secrets. And it demonstrated that sometimes justice came not from sophisticated investigative techniques, but from the courage of a 16-year-old boy who called the police when confronted with horror, and from a community of investigators who refused to stop until the truth was uncovered. The Victorian house on that quiet street in Selwood would never be the same, forever marked by what had been discovered within its walls. But for the families of Leah Brennan and Iris Dalton, and for Ethan Marlowe, The end of the trial brought something they had not had in a long time: certainty, closure, and the knowledge that the person responsible would never hurt anyone again.